Adolf Hitler, a name that terrified the world in the 1940s. A man whose ambitions dragged Europe into fire, whose armies crossed borders with terrifying speed, and whose ideology turned war into extermination. But behind all his conquests, behind the fall of Poland, France, the Balkans, and much of Europe, there was one enemy Hitler always believed would be his greatest: the Soviet Union. Hitler had never hidden his hatred of communism. To him, Bolshevism was not merely a political rival. It was an existential enemy. He saw the Soviet state as a monstrous force that had to be destroyed, and he saw the vast lands of Russia, Ukraine, and the Caucasus as the prize that would allow Germany to become the dominant power of the world. He wanted land. He wanted grain. He wanted oil. He wanted resources. And above all, he wanted what he called Lebensraum, living space for the German people. By the early months of 1941, while Hitler stayed at the Berghof, his mountain retreat in the Bavarian Alps, he began planning the greatest gamble of his life: Operation Barbarossa, the full-scale invasion of the Soviet Union. It would be the largest military operation the world had ever seen, and it would change the course of the Second World War forever. Across German-occupied Europe, armies began moving quietly toward the east. Trains carried tanks, artillery, ammunition, fuel, horses, and soldiers toward Poland and the Soviet frontier. Thousands of tanks, hundreds of aircraft, millions of men, all were being prepared for one colossal strike. Yet on paper, the Soviet Union was still Germany's partner. In 1939, Hitler and Stalin had signed a non-aggression pact. Together, their regimes had divided Poland. For a time, the two dictators had traded goods, raw materials, and strategic advantages. But neither trusted the other. Hitler saw the pact as temporary. Stalin hoped it would buy time. And Stalin desperately needed time, because the Soviet Union was not ready for war. The Red Army had once been one of the largest and potentially most modern armies in the world. But in the late 1930s, Stalin had crippled it with his own paranoia. During the Great Purge, thousands of officers were arrested, imprisoned, or executed. A huge portion of the army's senior leadership was destroyed. Experienced commanders vanished. In their place came men who were often less capable, less confident, and terrified of making decisions without approval from above. Many feared Stalin more than they understood war. So while German troops poured toward the Soviet border, Stalin clung to the hope that peace could be preserved. He gave strict orders that nothing should be done to provoke Hitler. Soviet commanders were told not to respond aggressively to German reconnaissance, border violations, or suspicious troop movements. Intelligence reports arrived again and again, warning that an invasion was coming. Soviet spies reported it. British intelligence warned Moscow. Defectors warned of German plans. Even the scale of German deployment on the border made the danger obvious. But Stalin refused to believe it. He thought Hitler would not risk a two-front war while Britain was still undefeated. He suspected British warnings were attempts to provoke war between Germany and the Soviet Union. He convinced himself that Hitler was bluffing. And because Stalin refused to believe the truth, millions of Soviet soldiers waited in exposed positions, unprepared for the storm that was about to break. But before Hitler could turn fully east, he had one more task. He had to secure his southern flank. Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary were already aligned with Germany. But in March 1941, the pro-German government of Yugoslavia was overthrown by forces more sympathetic to Britain. Greece, too, was friendly to Britain and had already resisted Mussolini's failed Italian invasion. Hitler could not allow instability in the Balkans before attacking the Soviet Union. So, on April 6, 1941, German forces invaded. 33 German divisions moved into Yugoslavia and Greece. The result was devastating. Yugoslavia collapsed with shocking speed. Its defenses were torn apart, and the capital, Belgrade, surrendered on April 12. Greece fell almost as quickly, despite British assistance. Athens was captured in less than 3 weeks. The Balkans campaign was a success, but it cost Hitler time. Precious weeks had been lost. And in Russia, time would become one of the most decisive weapons of all. Now the road to Barbarossa was open. More than 4 million Axis soldiers were about to be thrown into battle, supported by over 3,000 aircraft. The plan called for 3 massive simultaneous blows. Army Group North would drive through the Baltic states and seize Leningrad. Army Group Center would strike toward Minsk, Smolensk, and then Moscow. Army Group South would push into Ukraine, seize its grain fields, and eventually open the road toward the Caucasus and its oil. When Hitler showed the plan to his generals, many were uneasy. The operation was enormous. The distances were terrifying. The Soviet Union was not France. It was not Poland. It was a continent-sized empire with endless space, terrible roads, harsh weather, and a population capable of absorbing catastrophic losses. Some German officers feared the plan was too ambitious. They worried that the three army groups would spread themselves too thin. They worried about supplies, fuel, spare parts, railways, and the coming winter. But few dared to speak openly. Hitler had become the unquestioned master of Germany's military machine. To doubt him was dangerous. To challenge him could end a career. So the generals prepared. The Red Army, on paper, was larger than the German army. It had millions of men, thousands of aircraft, and more than 20,000 tanks, far more than Germany possessed. But numbers alone did not tell the whole story. Many Soviet tanks were obsolete. Many aircraft were outdated. Many units were poorly led. Communications were weak. Commanders were confused. And the army's leadership had been scarred by years of fear and purges. The key question for Germany was simple. Could speed, coordination, experience, and superior tactics destroy the Soviet forces before their vast numbers overwhelmed the German invaders? At 3:15 in the morning on June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa began. Before dawn, German artillery opened fire along a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. The Luftwaffe rose into the sky and struck Soviet airfields. At the same time, German infantry, tanks, engineers, and motorized columns surged across the border. The invasion had begun. German troops crossed the Bug River on the frontier between occupied Poland and the Soviet Union. Within hours, Hitler's tanks were moving deep into Soviet territory. Within 2 days, some panzer units had advanced more than 50 miles. Soviet counterattacks were poorly coordinated and quickly smashed. Tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers were surrounded. The Luftwaffe dominated the air. German aircraft destroyed Soviet planes on the ground before many could even take off. Airfields burned. Fuel depots exploded. Communications collapsed. In the first days of the invasion, the Red Air Force suffered devastating losses. The Red Army Command seemed paralyzed. Orders were confused. Units lost contact with headquarters. Some commanders did not know whether to retreat, counterattack, or hold their positions. The speed and violence of the German assault overwhelmed them. On June 29th, only 7 days after the invasion began, two great panzer movements met near Minsk, trapping huge Soviet forces. When German infantry arrived to seal the pockets, more than 300,000 Soviet prisoners were taken. The number was staggering. It seemed to confirm everything Hitler believed. The Soviet state, he thought, was rotten. The Red Army was collapsing. Victory would come quickly. In many areas, especially in Ukraine and the Baltic states, German soldiers were initially welcomed by some locals as liberators. Many people had suffered terribly under Stalin's rule. In Ukraine, memories of forced collectivization and famine were still fresh. Some believed the Germans might free them from Soviet terror. But the illusion would not last. The Nazi occupation would soon reveal itself as brutal, racist, and murderous. Villages would be burned. Civilians would be shot. Jews would be massacred. Prisoners of war would be starved. The war in the East was not merely a war of armies. It was an ideological war. A war of conquest. A war of annihilation. In Moscow, Stalin was shaken by the news of Hitler's betrayal. For days, he seemed unable to respond publicly. The invasion he had refused to believe was happening. The pact he had relied on had become meaningless. His own misjudgment had helped leave the Soviet Union exposed. It was not until July 3rd that Stalin finally addressed the Soviet people. His speech appealed to patriotism, history, and survival. He spoke not only as a communist leader, but as the defender of the motherland. This was no longer only a war for the Soviet system. It was a war for Russia itself. A war for every city, every village, every field, every family. In Britain, Winston Churchill received the news of Barbarossa with very different emotions. For almost a year, Britain had stood largely alone against Nazi Germany. Now, suddenly, Hitler had created a new enemy for himself. Churchill despised communism, but he hated Nazism more. He declared that anyone fighting Hitler was, for the moment, Britain's ally. A British mission was sent to Moscow to arrange cooperation with Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov. But beyond sending supplies by sea, Britain could do little immediately. The real fight would be decided on the vast plains of the Soviet Union. As June turned into July, the German advance continued. Army Group Center drove deeper and deeper. The blitzkrieg seemed unstoppable. But already, hidden beneath the victories, the weaknesses of Barbarossa were beginning to appear. The Soviet Union was not collapsing as quickly as expected. Soviet armies were being destroyed, but new ones kept appearing. German tanks could race ahead, but infantry, artillery, horses, supplies, and fuel moved much more slowly. The farther the Germans advanced, the longer their supply lines became. Roads were poor. Railways had a different gauge. Vehicles broke down. Dust clogged engines. Horses died. Fuel had to be hauled across enormous distances. Even in victory, the German army was being stretched. In early July, with hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops encircled west of Minsk, panzer commanders, especially General Heinz Guderian, wanted to push immediately toward Moscow. To them, the logic was clear. The Soviet capital was the political, military, and communications heart of the country. If Moscow fell quickly, perhaps Soviet resistance might collapse. Barbarossa seemed to be working perfectly. Within weeks, German armored spearheads reached Smolensk, deep inside Russia and only a few hundred miles from Moscow. On July 16th, another huge encirclement formed east of Smolensk, trapping hundreds of thousands more Soviet troops. Again, German infantry had to catch up before the pocket could be reduced. And again, the delay cost time. Columns of Soviet prisoners marched westward in enormous lines. Many would never return home. Millions of Soviet prisoners of war would die in German captivity from starvation, exposure, disease, and deliberate neglect. By late summer, Moscow was roughly 200 miles away. The road seemed open. Many German commanders believed the capital could fall before autumn. But elsewhere, the German advance was meeting greater difficulties. In the south, the Red Army resisted more stubbornly. Army Group South was still struggling toward Kiev. Hitler now made a decision that would become one of the most debated of the war. Instead of allowing Guderian's panzers to continue toward Moscow, he ordered them south to help encircle Soviet forces around Kiev. Guderian objected strongly. Many generals believed Moscow should remain the priority. But Hitler was determined. He wanted Ukraine. He wanted its grain. He wanted to destroy the Soviet armies in the south before moving on the capital. The panzers turned away from Moscow. The decision brought another great tactical victory. In August and September 1941, German armored forces from Army Group Center and Army Group South moved like giant claws around Kiev. On September 16th, the pincers met east of the city. 2 Soviet armies were destroyed. More than 500,000 Soviet soldiers were killed or captured. It was one of the largest encirclements in military history. For Hitler, it seemed like proof of genius. But the cost was time. The road to Moscow had been left waiting. And in Russia, every week mattered. On the same day that German forces were completing the destruction around Kiev, far to the north, Army Group North reached Leningrad. Leningrad, today St. Petersburg, was one of the great cities of the Soviet Union. It was a symbol of revolution, industry, culture, and national pride. The Germans surrounded it and cut it off from the rest of the country. Hitler decided not to storm the city. Instead, he would starve it into submission. The siege of Leningrad began. The conditions inside the city became almost unimaginable. The only link to the rest of the Soviet Union was across Lake Ladoga to the east. At first, only limited food could reach the city by water. Hunger spread. Rations fell. People ate anything they could find. Wallpaper paste. Leather. Pets disappeared from the streets. Families froze in apartments without heat. Bodies lay in the snow. In November alone, tens of thousands died from starvation. When winter froze Lake Ladoga, a road across the ice, the road of life, allowed some supplies to enter and civilians to escape. But it was never enough. At times, thousands died in a single day. The siege would last around 900 days. Nearly 1 million people would die. Leningrad became one of the great tragedies of the war and one of the great symbols of Soviet endurance. Meanwhile, Army Group Center prepared for the final assault on Moscow. Guderian's tanks returned from the south. The Germans assembled for Operation Typhoon. On the Moscow front, they enjoyed superiority in tanks, aircraft, and experienced troops. The offensive began in early October 1941. Once again, German panzers broke through Soviet defenses. By October 7th, more Soviet forces had been encircled around Vyazma and Bryansk. The road to Moscow seemed to open again. But Stalin was determined to defend the capital. He appointed Marshal Georgy Zhukov to organize the defense. Zhukov was one of the greatest commanders of the Second World War. Hard, disciplined, ruthless, and brilliant, he understood the crisis clearly. Moscow had to be held. The population was mobilized. Women, children, elderly citizens, workers, and students dug trenches, anti-tank ditches, and defensive lines around the city. Factories were evacuated eastward. Government offices prepared for possible relocation. But Stalin stayed in Moscow. His presence mattered. It sent a message that the capital would not be abandoned without a fight. Yet the greatest obstacle facing the Germans was not only Soviet resistance. It was the weather. On October 8th, heavy rains began across the Eastern Front. The Russian autumn mud season, the Rasputitsa, arrived. Roads dissolved into rivers of mud. German trucks sank up to their axles. Horses struggled. Tanks bogged down. Supply columns stalled. The blitzkrieg slowed to a crawl. Every mile became a battle against mud. By late October, the combination of worsening weather, Soviet resistance, and exhausted German logistics left Army Group Center still around 50 miles from Moscow. Hitler was now paying the price for the delay caused by the diversion to Kiev. The lost weeks were becoming fatal. Then the cold came. German troops had expected the campaign to end before winter. Many had no proper winter clothing. Engines failed. Weapons froze. Lubricants thickened. Men suffered frostbite. Some froze to death in their positions. Still, in late November and early December, the Germans made one last push toward Moscow. By December 4th, forward German units were only about 19 miles from Red Square. Some reconnaissance troops claimed they could see the golden domes of the Kremlin. But that night, temperatures plunged again. Tank engines refused to start. Rifles froze. Soldiers could barely move. On December 5th, the German attack stopped. Winter had helped save the Red Army. But the cold alone did not save Moscow. For months, Stalin had worried that Japan might attack the Soviet Far East. Because of that fear, many well-trained Soviet divisions remained in Siberia. Then, in November 1941, Soviet intelligence received a vital report from Richard Sorg, a Soviet spy in Tokyo. Japan would not attack Siberia. It would strike south instead. This information changed everything. Siberian divisions, trained and equipped for winter warfare, began moving west by rail toward Moscow. By early December, hundreds of thousands of fresh Soviet troops had arrived near the capital. On December 5th, just as the Germans were giving up their attempt to seize Moscow, the Red Army struck. First came a massive artillery barrage. Then waves of Soviet infantry and T-34 tanks slammed into German lines. The Germans were stunned. Exhausted, frozen, and stretched thin, they reeled backward. For the next several days, Soviet attacks tore into Army Group Center. The myth of German invincibility had been broken. For Hitler, it was a terrible blow. In December, he dismissed the Army Commander-in-Chief, Field Marshal Walther von Brauchitsch, and took personal command of the army himself. He also dismissed or sidelined several senior officers, including Heinz Guderian. Hitler now issued a brutal order. There would be no more withdrawals. German troops were to stand and fight. If necessary, they would die where they stood. In the short term, the order helped stabilize the German front. But it also revealed something dangerous. Hitler now believed willpower could replace strategy. He believed that refusing retreat was itself a military solution. This attitude would later destroy entire German armies. Stalin, encouraged by the victory outside Moscow, demanded offensives across the entire front. Zhukov tried to restrain him, warning that the Red Army still needed time and strength. But Stalin was intoxicated by success. For months, battles raged inconclusively around German defensive positions. The Soviet Union had survived the first Great Storm. Barbarossa had failed to destroy it. And now Germany faced a new problem. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor. A few days later, in a decision that shocked even some of his own leaders, Hitler declared war on the United States. Now Germany had gained another gigantic enemy. The war had become global in the fullest sense. As 1941 turned into 1942, Hitler remained determined to attack again in Russia. But he needed a new strategy. The original idea of advancing across the entire front was no longer realistic. Germany's oil supplies were strained. The Wehrmacht needed fuel. So Hitler looked south, to the oil fields of the Caucasus. The plan for the 1942 campaign, Operation Blue, aimed to strike through southern Russia. Army Group A would push toward the Caucasus and seize the oil fields. Army Group B would cover its flank along the Don River and, eventually, toward the Volga. At first, the offensive went well. German forces broke through Soviet defenses. Large numbers of Soviet soldiers were captured. The Germans tightened their siege of Sevastopol in Crimea, which had resisted for months under constant bombardment. In late June 1942, Sevastopol finally fell. Then, in late June and early July, the main offensive began. Army Group B pushed toward the Don. Army Group A drove toward Rostov and the Caucasus. But soon Hitler made another series of dangerous strategic decisions. He divided his forces. He demanded too much from too few men. And then he became obsessed with a city on the Volga, Stalingrad. At first, Stalingrad was important because it stood on the Volga River, a major supply route. It was also an industrial city, producing tractors, vehicles, weapons, and equipment. But its symbolic value mattered even more. It bore Stalin's name. For Hitler, capturing Stalingrad became personal. For Stalin, losing it was unthinkable. On August 7, 1942, General Friedrich Paulus and the German Sixth Army crossed the Don River and began their final push toward Stalingrad. Within days, German armored units reached the Volga north of the city. German troops entered the suburbs. Hitler seemed close to a famous victory. Stalingrad stretched for miles along the western bank of the Volga. Factories, apartment blocks, warehouses, rail yards, and docks turned into defensive positions. The Soviet people transformed the city into a fortress. The German plan was to assault it directly. What followed became one of the longest, bloodiest, and most brutal battles of the Second World War. German troops advanced street by street. Stuka dive bombers screamed overhead. Artillery shattered buildings. Factories became battlefields. Apartments became bunkers. Cellars became command posts. Sewers became routes of movement. The fighting was savage. House to house. Floor to floor. Room to room. Sometimes soldiers fought for a staircase, a wall, a machine room, or a pile of rubble. The Soviets clung to the city with extraordinary determination. Reinforcements crossed the Volga under fire, often at night, often under bombardment. Many died before reaching the western bank. But still they came. By late September, the Germans had forced their way through much of the city. For Hitler, Stalingrad became an obsession. On October 14th, Paulus launched what was supposed to be the final assault. German tanks and infantry pushed through the ruins. One German officer said progress was measured not in meters, but in corpses. It seemed that German victory was close. But in reality, the Germans were dangerously exposed. Their flanks, north and south of the city, were held not by strong German units, but by weaker Allied forces, Romanians, Italians, and Hungarians. The Red Army saw the opportunity. By mid-November, Soviet commanders had secretly assembled enormous forces around Stalingrad. More than 1 million men, thousands of guns, hundreds of tanks, aircraft, a vast striking force hidden from German eyes. On November 19, 1942, the Soviets attacked the northern flank. After a huge artillery barrage, T-34 tanks smashed through Romanian lines. The next day, Soviet forces attacked from the south. Again, the Axis lines collapsed. On November 23rd, the Soviet pincers met west of Stalingrad. The German Sixth Army was trapped. Around 250,000 Axis troops were encircled. Paulus could have tried to break out, but Hitler ordered him to stand and fight. The Luftwaffe promised that enough supplies could be flown into Stalingrad by air. Hitler believed them. It was a disastrous illusion. The trapped army needed hundreds of tons of supplies every day. It received only a fraction of that. Weather was terrible. Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft guns made flying dangerous. Airfields were lost. Men began to starve. Ammunition ran low. Fuel disappeared. Horses were slaughtered for food. The wounded froze. To rescue Paulus, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein launched Operation Winterstorm in December 1942. Panzer forces tried to break through the Soviet ring. For a short time, they made progress. But Soviet resistance stiffened. By late December, the relief force had stalled roughly 30 miles from the city. Manstein urged Paulus to break out and meet him, but Paulus would not disobey Hitler. Hitler refused permission. The chance was lost. Zhukov and the Soviet command then struck the relief forces and pushed them back. By the end of December, all hope of rescuing the Sixth Army was gone. On January 8, 1943, the Soviets offered the Germans a chance to surrender. They refused. The Soviet final assault began. The German pocket shrank. Men fought from cellars, factories, and ruins. Many were sick, starving, frostbitten, and out of ammunition. On January 30th, Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal, hoping he would understand the message. No German Field Marshal had ever been captured alive. Hitler expected suicide, but Paulus chose life. On January 31st, 1943, he surrendered. The remaining German forces in the northern pocket surrendered days later. More than 90,000 German soldiers went into captivity. Only a few thousand would ever return home. The rest died in Soviet camps from hunger, disease, cold, and exhaustion. Stalingrad was a catastrophe for Germany. The Germans lost hundreds of thousands of men, including Allied troops. The Soviets also suffered enormous losses, including countless civilians. But the strategic meaning was clear. Germany had suffered its greatest defeat of the war so far. The aura of inevitable German victory was gone. After Stalingrad, Marshal Zhukov and the Soviet High Command were determined to exploit the momentum. Soviet forces pushed west and south, threatening German armies still deep in the Caucasus. There was a real danger that Army Group A could be cut off completely. That would have created a disaster even greater than Stalingrad. With few options left, Hitler reluctantly allowed a withdrawal from the Caucasus. It was a bitter decision for him. His dream of capturing the Soviet oil fields had failed. Over the following weeks, German forces carried out a skilled fighting retreat through mountains, valleys, snow, and terrible conditions. Manstein managed to save much of the southern German force from complete destruction. Then, in January 1943, the Red Army launched a massive winter offensive across a huge front. The Germans were badly outnumbered. Manstein conducted a mobile defense, retreating carefully, striking selectively, and trying to slow the Soviet advance. By the end of February, the Red Army had retaken Kursk and Kharkov. Germany had lost immense numbers of men, tanks, guns, trucks, and equipment in only a few months. These losses could not easily be replaced. The Soviet Union, by contrast, was becoming stronger. Its factories, many moved beyond the Ural Mountains, were producing weapons in enormous quantities. The Red Army had deep reserves of manpower. Western aid also flowed into the Soviet Union: trucks, food, aircraft, raw materials, and equipment. Perhaps most importantly, Germany was losing the technological advantage it had once enjoyed. The Soviet T-34 tank was one of the best tanks of the war. Its sloped armor, wide tracks, powerful gun, and reliability made it a formidable opponent. The Soviets also used the Katyusha rocket launcher, which German soldiers called Stalin's organ because of its terrifying sound. The Red Army was no longer the stunned, disorganized force of June 1941. It was becoming a war machine, experienced, angry, increasingly well-equipped, and determined to drive the Germans all the way back to Berlin. But Hitler refused to accept reality. Despite the disasters of Moscow, Stalingrad, and the Caucasus, he still dreamed of one more decisive summer offensive. He believed a powerful attack could break Soviet strength, restore German initiative, and prove that the Wehrmacht remained superior. Looking at the maps, one place stood out: Kursk. After the Soviet winter offensive, the front line formed a large bulge around the city of Kursk, protruding westward into German-held territory. To Hitler, it seemed like an obvious target. If German forces attacked from the north and south, they could pinch off the salient, surround the Soviet troops inside, and destroy them. It would be a giant armored trap. Hitler also believed he had a secret advantage: a new generation of German tanks. The Tiger, the Panther, powerful machines designed to restore Germany's battlefield edge against the T-34. The Tiger was massive, heavily armored, and armed with the deadly 88mm gun. Its frontal armor was extremely difficult for Soviet anti-tank guns to penetrate. The Panther was faster and more maneuverable, with a powerful 75mm gun and sloped armor inspired partly by the T-34 itself. Hitler believed these new tanks could win the coming battle. But they were new, complex, and difficult to produce. To bring enough of them to the front, Hitler delayed the offensive. The delay would prove costly, because while the Germans waited, the Soviets prepared. Zhukov guessed exactly what was coming. Soviet intelligence confirmed it. Partisans reported German movements. Spies provided information. The Red Army knew where the Germans would attack. And it knew roughly when. So instead of launching a reckless offensive of his own, Zhukov advised Stalin to let the Germans attack first. The Soviets would absorb the blow, bleed the German armored forces, and then counterattack. Around Kursk, the Red Army built one of the most formidable defensive systems in military history. Multiple belts of trenches, anti-tank ditches, minefields, barbed wire, camouflaged artillery positions, strong points, bunkers, hidden anti-tank guns, reserves placed deep behind the front. The defenses extended for miles and miles. Hundreds of thousands of mines were laid. Every likely German route was studied. Every village, ridge, road, and field became part of the trap. Zhukov also built up enormous reserves. More men, more tanks, more guns, more aircraft. By the eve of the German attack, the Soviets were ready. The German attackers thought they were preparing a surprise blow. But the defenders were waiting for them. In the early hours of July 5, 1943, just as German troops prepared for their offensive, Soviet artillery opened fire first. Zhukov had decided to strike the German assembly areas before they could begin. Thousands of shells crashed into German positions. The bombardment caused confusion and casualties, but it did not stop the attack. The Germans moved forward. Operation Citadel had begun. From the north and south, German armor advanced toward Kursk. Tiger and Panther tanks rolled into battle. Infantry followed. Artillery fired. Aircraft roared overhead. But this was not Poland. This was not France. This was not the early blitzkrieg of 1941. The Germans were attacking an enemy that knew they were coming, had prepared for months, and had built layered defenses designed to absorb exactly this kind of blow. There would be no quick breakthrough. Instead, the battle became slow, brutal, and costly. In the northern sector, the German advance gained only a few miles at enormous cost. Minefields damaged tanks. Anti-tank guns fired from concealed positions. Soviet artillery hammered the attackers. Every line taken revealed another behind it. Every field became a killing ground. In the southern sector, the Germans did somewhat better. They drove a deeper wedge into Soviet defenses. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that they might achieve a breakthrough. But the price was terrible. Elite German units lost men and tanks they could not replace. Then, on July 12, 1943, near the village of Prokhorovka, Zhukov threw in powerful reserves. Hundreds of Soviet tanks surged into the German flank. The fighting became one of the most famous armored clashes of the war. Tanks rushed toward each other at close range. The Soviets tried to close the distance, where the long-range advantage of German guns would matter less. The battlefield descended into smoke, fire, dust, and chaos. Tanks burned. Crews died inside their vehicles. Artillery shells burst across the field. Aircraft fought overhead. The battle was savage and confused. For both sides, losses were heavy. But for Germany, the losses were more dangerous. The Red Army could replace men and machines faster than the Wehrmacht could. The Luftwaffe, too, was losing control of the skies. The Soviet Air Force was growing stronger. More aircraft, more pilots, more coordination. Soviet ground attack aircraft, including the feared Il-2 Sturmovik, struck German armor and vehicles. By mid-July, the German offensive had failed. Whatever ground the Germans had gained around Kursk had been bought at a price they could not afford. Hitler's gamble was over. The Wehrmacht had lost tens of thousands of men and hundreds of tanks. More importantly, it had lost the last chance to regain the strategic initiative in the east. Kursk was a turning point. After Kursk, Germany would never again launch a major strategic offensive on the Eastern Front. From this moment onward, the Red Army would advance. Slowly at first, then faster. It would liberate Soviet lands village by village, city by city. It would push through Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, Poland, and Eastern Europe. And finally, it would reach Berlin itself. The end of the Third Reich did not begin only in the ruins of Berlin. It began on the frozen roads before Moscow, in the shattered factories of Stalingrad, and on the burning tank fields of Kursk. Operation Barbarossa had been Hitler's greatest gamble. It was meant to destroy the Soviet Union in a single campaign. Instead, it awakened a giant. It turned the Eastern Front into the graveyard of the German army. And it began the long, bloody road that would end with Soviet soldiers raising their flag over the ruins of Nazi Berlin. Hitler had invaded the Soviet Union dreaming of empire. What he found instead was endless distance, brutal winter, unbreakable resistance, and a war of attrition Germany could not win. The fields of Russia consumed his armies. The cities of the Soviet Union broke his myth. And the people he believed would collapse rose with a determination that carried them all the way to victory. In the end, the war Hitler unleashed in the East became the war that destroyed him. The invasion that was supposed to secure Germany's future became the beginning of its ruin. And the road to Berlin began not in the West, but in the blood-soaked soil of the Eastern Front.